Me and my wife? Yeah, we were tight, like soulmates, living that perfect life together. Sure, we had our little spats, but nothing big. It was always over dumb stuff. Like, take this one time. She got real upset with me because I totally spaced on her mom's birthday. Yeah, I messed up, no doubt. But I wasn't about to just let that slide. So, I sent her mom this massive bouquet, had it delivered by a courier. And for my wife? Well, I hooked her up with some fresh new Alex's she'd been eyeing for a while. That definitely smoothed things over fast. She was happy, the whole mood changed, and we even made a deal to remind each other about important dates from then on. Moments like that? They were funny, even kind of cute. It felt like every little hiccup just made us stronger, like we were made for each other. Life was this sweet fairy tale that seemed too good to be true. But, as they say, every fairy tale's gotta end eventually. It all went down at the start of summer. It was one of those early June days when the heat hadn't really kicked in yet, and the sun was just perfect. I got home after a long day, and there she was, my wife, hustling around, setting the table. She was busy, rushing from one side of the room to the other, getting everything just right. I noticed something odd, though, 3 plates on the table instead of the usual 2. We expecting company, or something? I asked, kinda curious. Oh, yeah, Alex, you won't believe it. My second cousin hit me up a few days ago. We haven't seen each other since we were kids. He's passing through town and I figured, why not invite him over? He should be here any minute now, she answered, all flustered and excited. I squinted a bit, trying to recall if she'd ever mentioned having a cousin like that. It felt off. I definitely didn't remember her ever bringing him up. You never told me about this cousin before. Got any pictures of him? I asked, heading towards the bathroom. Yeah, let me check, she called back, hurrying over to dig through some old photo albums. For a few minutes, she sat flipping through the pages, staring hard at old childhood photos, but after a bit, she looked up with a shrug. Looks like they're all at my mom's place. I can't find any here, she said, sounding a little bummed out, but then quickly added, no big deal, I'll show you some later. Her voice was casual, but there was something just a little off about the way she said it. Nothing major, but enough to make me pause for a second. Still, I shrugged it off and went about my business. This cousin of hers would show up soon enough, and I'd see for myself. All right, come on, take a seat, I said, motioning to the table. Just as I spoke, the doorbell rang. My wife, looking all flustered and excited, practically rushed to answer it. When she swung the door open, there stood a tall, broad-shouldered guy. He looked a good 10 years younger than us, but with a confidence that said he knew his way around the world. Alex, I said, extending my hand to him as I stepped forward, inviting him in. Henry, he replied, giving me a firm handshake. His grip was strong but friendly, the kind that makes you feel at ease. My wife immediately took over, practically buzzing with energy. She took his jacket, flashing him a warm smile, and pointed out where the bathroom was. She was on top of things, like she'd been waiting for this all night. In the kitchen, the smell of her famous roast duck filled the air, and man, it smelled good dash. The table was all set, with a pitcher of wine sitting there, its sides all misty, promising something smooth and refreshing. So, how about a toast? I asked, pouring wine into glasses and holding mine up with a smile. Henry nodded, and we clinked our glasses. The conversation flowed easily, like we were old friends catching up. Turns out, Henry's a manager at some construction company. This time, he was in town checking out some land for a new housing development. He talked about his job, about the project, but there was something else hanging in the air. All the while, my wife couldn't take her eyes off him. She was watching his every move, smiling every time he spoke, and kept refilling his plate like she was his personal chef. It was obvious. She was glowing, and I couldn't ignore how weird it felt watching all that unfold. When it got late, we offered him to crash at our place for the night. It didn't feel right to send him off to some hotel at this hour, and he didn't seem to mind. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, I glanced over at my wife. Wow, you really lit up tonight, I said, half joking but also kinda serious. Chatting nonstop like that. Guess having family around brings out the best in you. She smiled back, but there was something in her eyes. Something different. Something I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I was just imagining things. Oh, totally. You have no idea, my wife chimed in, her voice bubbling with excitement. The moment Henry showed up, it's like I was hit with this wave of childhood memories. Nostalgia, you know? It's like going back in time. He hasn't changed much, except now he's all grown up and doing great for himself. The next morning, over breakfast, I offered Henry a ride. "Thanks, man, but I'll grab a taxi. I still need to figure out where I'm staying tonight," he replied casually. Before I could say anything, my wife jumped in. "Why bother looking? Henry, why don't you just stay here with us?" she asked, throwing me a quick glance, waiting for my approval. I didn't see any issue with it. After all, he was family, right? There was no harm in him crashing with us for a few days, so I agreed. Henry gave me a grateful nod and decided to stay. At first, everything was cool, just the usual. But one afternoon, I came home earlier than usual and found Henry walking down the hallway, shirtless. It caught me off guard. He shot me a quick grin, extended his hand for a handshake, and then darted into the bathroom. It was kind of weird, but I brushed it off, figuring he was just comfortable around us. When I got further into the apartment, I noticed the bedroom door was shut. I knocked gently. "Can I come in?" "Yeah, Alex, sure. I was just changing. Got a little messy while cooking dinner," she called from the other side. A few minutes later, she opened the door. Her face lit up with that same cheerful smile. "I'm so glad you're home early," she chirped. "Henry's back too. Let's set the table and have a little celebration." Her energy was so upbeat, and she moved around with such ease that I couldn't help but smile back. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny bit of doubt began to creep in. Something just felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Wait, do we have something to celebrate?" I asked, feeling a bit confused by my wife's overly excited mood. "Yeah, my brother just bought a new car," she replied with a proud grin. "Check it out, it's parked right outside." I glanced out the window, and sure enough, there it was, a brand new Tesla, shining under the fading sunlight. The car looked sleek, no doubt about it. But what really caught my attention was how my wife seemed glued to her brother all evening. She was laughing, grinning from ear to ear, and after a few glasses of wine, she got a little tipsy and kept planting playful kisses on Henry's cheek. She even wrapped her arm around him like they were best buddies from way back. At first, I tried to ignore it, but by the end of the night, things were getting a little too close for comfort. I gently pulled her aside, guiding her to the bedroom to cool things down a bit. Sitting her on the bed, I calmly reminded her that Henry was still a guest and that maybe she should dial down the brotherly love just a tad. 2 weeks went by since Henry showed up, and it was pretty clear he had no plans to leave. His stuff was still sitting in the corner of the living room, and honestly, the whole vibe of the house was starting to change. My wife kept giving him so much attention, I was starting to feel like a third wheel in my own home. One day at work, a colleague of mine brought in some fresh mandarins from a trip abroad. I knew my wife was allergic to citrus, so I figured I'd take the mandarins to her parents instead. During my lunch break, I made the quick trip to their place. When I arrived, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Madison, greeted me with her usual wide smile and invited me in for a cup of tea. I had some time, so I thought, why not? As we sat in the kitchen, sipping tea and chatting about the usual stuff, she casually asked how things were going at home. I mentioned Henry's arrival and how he's been staying with us for 2 weeks now, seemingly with no plan to leave anytime soon. Mrs. Madison gave me a thoughtful look, but stayed quiet for a moment. That silence felt heavier than it should have. Then, with a slight squint in her eyes, she finally said, "How interesting." Hold up, hold up. What do you mean, brother?" Mrs. Madison asked, her face scrunching up in confusion. "Cousin. Like, second cousin," I replied, taking another sip from my mug, trying to play it cool. But I could see something wasn't sitting right with her. "Nah, you must be confused. My husband and I don't have any nephews, only nieces. Whole bunch of 'em. We even joke about having a girl squad," she said with a chuckle, but I could sense a shift in her tone. Then she got up and headed to the living room for something. I just sat there, my mind racing. If there were no nephews, then who the hell was this guy staying at my place for 2 weeks? Suddenly, everything made sense. The weird vibes, my wife's sudden bursts of excitement, and Henry's cocky little smirks. This dude wasn't her cousin. He wasn't family at all. Mrs. Madison came back with an old photo album, flipping through pictures, pointing out all her nieces. But at that point, I wasn't even listening anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I mumbled a quick goodbye and bolted out the door. The drive back home was a blur. My head was spinning with questions, anger bubbling up inside of me. Who was this guy? How did he worm his way into our house? And most importantly, what was my wife thinking? I burst into the apartment, and that's when I heard it. Odd noises coming from our bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest. Trying to stay quiet, I crept towards the door and peeked in. And there they were, My wife and her so-called brother, standing way too close, arms wrapped around each other. It was obvious, plain as day, what was going on. I couldn't stop myself. I slammed the door open, grabbed her by the hair, and shoved her hard into the corner of the room. Henry jumped in, trying to block me, but I was too fast. I clocked him right in the jaw, sending him crashing down to the floor. I was completely lost in rage the moment Henry hit the floor after my punch. The room was silent, but all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears, my heart racing with anger. I stood over him, my chest heaving, my breath coming out in rough bursts. Henry propped himself up on his elbows, blood trickling from his busted lip, but the dude had the nerve to smirk. That smug look on his face only fueled the fire inside me, like he thought this was all some kind of game. Grab your stuff and get the hell out. I barked, my voice shaking with fury. I stomped over to the closet, yanked out his clothes, and threw them at his feet with a force that almost knocked him back down. My wife, who had been standing there, frozen in shock, suddenly broke down, rushing toward me, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my arms, pleading, begging me to listen, saying it wasn't what it looked like. She tried to pull me back, clutching at my shoulders, repeating over and over that I was wrong, that I didn't understand. But her words were just noise at that point, a dull hum drowned out by the roar of betrayal inside me. Henry, still wiping the blood from his lip, collected his things with that damn smirk still plastered on his face. He didn't say a word, just casually strolled out like he hadn't just shattered everything. The door slammed behind him with a deafening bang, but it felt so distant, like I was trapped in some fog, unable to feel anything but rage. My wife kept sobbing, trying to hold on to me, but I couldn't even look at her. I stormed into the bedroom, my hands shaking as I yanked open the closet and started throwing her clothes into a suitcase, ignoring her cries. Every word she said just made my blood boil hotter. When the suitcase was full, I dragged it out into the hall, opened the door, and shoved it out. Please, Alex, just listen to me. It's not what you think, she cried, standing in the hallway, tears pouring down her cheeks. I slammed the door in her face, shutting out her voice, and collapsed against it, the anger slowly giving way to a deep, painful ache. Even from behind the door, I could still hear her pleading, begging me to give her a chance. But I couldn't. Not then. I wasn't ready to hear any more lies. For days after, she'd wait for me outside, sitting on the steps, hoping I'd give her a chance. Every day after work, there she'd be, asking for just a few minutes to explain, her voice quieter, more desperate each time. Finally, worn down, I agreed to meet her. We stood outside our place, and I told her I'd hear her out. One last chance. But I thought after all her tears and begging, she'd finally get it through her head that there was no going back. But no, the anger I felt toward her wasn't fading, not even a little. Every time I remembered her face, pleading for forgiveness, it just stoked the fire inside me even more. She was trying to play the pity card, saying how sorry she was, how much she loved me. But those words felt as fake as a bad actor reading lines. How did she think I'd ever believe her after everything that came to light? Turns out, the whole situation was way more twisted than I initially thought. My wife didn't just team up with Henry for fun. She took out a massive loan in her name and handed him all the cash. He used it to buy that shiny car she was so proud of, the same one she pointed out to me from the window. They met on some random forum, and apparently, their little chat had been going on for months, maybe even longer. He had been slowly pulling her strings, weaving this whole elaborate plan to meet up and fool me. When I finally pieced everything together, it hit me that Henry saw the whole thing as some kind of sick game. He got off on watching me play the fool, trusting him, totally oblivious, while they pulled off their act. My wife, well, she didn't just play along. She seemed to enjoy the charade, right up until everything fell apart like a house of cards. She sat across from me, wiping her eyes, her voice trembling like she was about to burst into full-blown sobs. She kept saying how much she regretted everything, how she wished she could take it all back. But looking into her eyes, all I saw was emptiness. I didn't know what to believe anymore, and I honestly didn't care. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stand to have her in my life any longer. I told her, once again, in no uncertain terms, to stop chasing me, to leave, forever. I couldn't stomach her fake tears anymore, the ones that felt more like part of some overdramatic performance than anything real. How could she have agreed to be part of this twisted show? What was she even thinking? Did she actually believe I'd just brush it all off and start fresh? The sheer absurdity of it all blew my mind. But whatever she thought, it was dead wrong. Now all I felt was an empty, hollow void, and in some ways, that void was worse than all the anger.